Don't go back to your room tonight. And, whatever you do, don't let your husband know you heard us." She said it quietly, almost under her breath, like she wasn't sure she should be saying it at all. I remember standing in the hallway of that resort, barefoot on cool marble tile, holding a glass of water I'd gone to get because I couldn't sleep. The housekeeper was maybe 60, with silver-streaked hair tucked under her uniform cap and eyes that had seen too much to waste time lying. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked away, like she hadn't said anything at all. My name is Amara Voss. I was 31 years old that night, and I was 6 days into what I believed was the happiest chapter of my life. My husband, we'd been married just over a week, was asleep in the suite we'd upgraded to on a whim. Or, so I thought. The resort was a luxury property outside Sedona, all red rock views and sage-scented air, and private plunge pools on every terrace. We'd chosen it together, or I thought we had. He'd been unusually specific about this particular property, this particular wing, this particular suite number. I'd found that suite at the time. Thoughtful. Detail-oriented. That's what I told myself I was marrying. A man who paid attention. I didn't go back to the room. I stood in that corridor for a long moment after the housekeeper disappeared around the corner. The water in my glass was cold enough to make my hand ache. I told myself she was confused, that she'd mixed me up with another guest, that people who work night shifts at resorts see strange things, and sometimes say stranger ones. But my feet didn't move toward room 412. Instead, I moved toward the small alcove near the ice machine, at the end of the hall, pressed myself into the shadows and waited. I don't fully know why. Some part of me, the part that had noticed small things over the past 6 months and quietly filed them away without ever opening the drawer. That part knew I didn't have to wait long. The door to our suite opened at 12:47 a.m. I know the time, because I checked my phone the moment I heard the latch click. Some instinct telling me I'd want to remember this exactly. He stepped out into the hallway. Not groggy, not squinting. Alert. Dressed. He had his phone in one hand and his room's key in the other. And he walked with the easy confidence of a man going somewhere he'd planned to go. And then she appeared. She came from the stairwell at the far end of the corridor, not the elevator. Like she'd taken the route less likely to be recorded. I recognized her in the dim hallway lighting immediately, even though part of my brain tried to argue against it, tried to offer alternatives. Someone who looks like her. A coincidence. Anything. It wasn't a coincidence. Her name was Simone. She and my husband had dated for 2 years before we met. He'd told me she was volatile, manipulative, that she'd made his life hell after the breakup. He'd said it with such exhaustion in his voice that I'd felt sorry for him. I'd almost felt sorry for her too, in an abstract way. The kind of empathy you extend to a woman you've never met, who apparently loved someone who left her. I'd thought she was a footnote. She was not a footnote. She leaned against the walls beside him, and his whole posture changed. Relaxed. Familiar. The way bodies move when there's history between them that never really ended. "She didn't wake up?" Simone asked. "Out cold," he said. She took one of her sleep aids around 10. I gripped the wall behind me. I do take sleep aids occasionally. He knew this. He'd been the one who suggested them on this trip, actually. Said the altitude in Sedona sometimes disrupts sleep for people who aren't used to it. I'd thought that was considerate. "And the account?" Simone asked. He nodded slowly. Her financial advisor set it up before the wedding. Joint account for travel and household. She signed everything at the attorney's office. She didn't even read the secondary authorization clause. The funds transfer on day 10 unless one of us flags it. Day 10 of our honeymoon. We were on day 6. "How much?" she asked. "Between the inheritance and the investment portfolio her parents set up. Just under 400,000. My grandmother left me money when she died. I was 24, freshly out of grad school, and she'd spent her whole life saving. My parents had helped me put it into a protected portfolio. It was the foundation my grandmother built for me. dollar by dollar, over 60 years of careful living. I had cried at the attorney's office when I signed the paperwork to consolidate it into our joint account. I'd thought I was crying because I was happy. Because this was what trust looked like. "She's sweet," he said, and the way he said it turned my stomach. That's the thing. She genuinely believes in people. It's almost, he paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Easy. Simone laughed softly. You always pick the ones who want to believe. It's a skill, he said. I was standing 11 feet away from my husband, describing me like I was a door he'd already figured out how to pick. Sweet. Trusting. Easy. The hallway felt like it was narrowing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk out of that alcove, to let them see me, to watch their faces go pale. My hands were shaking hard enough that water sloshed over the rim of my glass. I pressed the cold rim against my palm to stay focused. I didn't move. Because somewhere under the shaking and the nausea and the particular specific grief of realizing your marriage is a transaction, a thought arrived, cold and clear as creek water. He was right about one thing. I do believe in people. But I also spent 3 years working in corporate litigation support before I got my certification in financial planning. I know what secondary authorization clauses look like. I know what they can be used for, and I know exactly what kind of evidence makes them unenforceable. The woman he thought he'd married would have walked out of that alcove and cried. I wasn't that woman anymore. Or maybe I never had been. Maybe she'd just been waiting in the wings for a reason to step forward. I stayed in the shadows until they went back inside. Separate rooms? I noted that. He returned to our suite, she returned to wherever she'd come from. I waited 10 more minutes. Then I walked calmly to the resort business center on the second floor. Logged onto a computer with my member credentials. And started making calls. The first call was to my father. He answered on the third ring, which meant he'd been awake. My father has never been a deep sleeper. He said, Amara, before I could say anything. In that voice he reserves for moments, when he already knows something has gone wrong, and I thought, he suspected. He never said it directly, but over the past year there had been small comments. Quiet questions. The way he'd looked at my husband at our rehearsal dinner. Not unfriendly, but watchful. I told him what I heard. All of it. Every word. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Don't touch the account. Don't say anything to him yet. I'll call Arthur in the morning. Arthur was my family's attorney. Had been for 20 years. I went back to the room. I slid into bed in the dark. My husband shifted, mumbled something. That might have been my name, and went still again. I lay there staring at the ceiling with the desert stars faintly visible through the skylight overhead. And I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd pressed a savings bond into my hand when I was 7 and said, This is yours, not anyone else's. Yours. About the look on her face when she said it, serious and warm at the same time. I thought, no one is taking what she left me. No one. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had composed myself into the version of myself he expected. Soft, affectionate, slightly apologetic for being out of it the night before. I let him order room service. I let him pour my coffee. I let him hold my hand across the breakfast table, while he talked about the hike we'd planned for the afternoon. You seem tired, he said, studying my face. I had strange dreams, I said. He nodded sympathetically. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. I smiled at him, and I thought, you have no idea. The hike happened. I took photos. I laughed at the right moments. When he reached for my hand at the overlook, I took it. The view was genuinely beautiful. That deep terracotta red against the impossible blue of the sky. And for 1/2 second, I let myself feel the loss of what I'd believed this week was. Then I put it somewhere it wouldn't get in the way of what I needed to do. That afternoon, while he showered, I made my second call. Arthur had already spoken with a forensic accountant he kept on retainer. What they'd found in the 12 hours since my father called him was worse than I'd expected. And I'd already expected something bad. This wasn't the first time. 2 years before we met, a woman named Arthur used only initials for privacy, had reported a similar loss through a joint account that had been established just before their engagement ended. The case hadn't gone to criminal trial. She'd settled quietly, likely because she was exhausted and scared and didn't want her finances to become public. Before that, another woman. Different state, similar structure. Small enough amounts that each incident on its own looked like a messy breakup rather than a pattern. Together, they looked like a business model. I was standing in the bathroom of a luxury resort in the Arizona desert in a fluffy robe with the tag still on it. Listening to Arthur explain to me that my husband had done this before, and that I was simply the biggest account he'd ever attempted, I pressed my hand flat against the marble vanity and breathed until the room stopped tilting. What do I need to do? What do I need to do? I asked. Arthur told me. When my husband came out of the shower, I was sitting on the terrace with a glass of sparkling water, watching the light shift on the rocks. He joined me, still toweling his hair, happy and unhurried, the ease of a man who thought everything was going according to plan. I was thinking, I said casually, that we should go over the financial stuff before we get back home. My advisor mentioned there might be some paperwork to finalize. He stilled just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Sure, he said. Whatever you want. I was thinking the day after tomorrow. Before checkout. That works, he said. And I heard the quiet satisfaction in his voice. Day 8. Plenty of time before the day 10 transfer. He thought I was handing him the timeline. I wasn't handing him anything. The day after tomorrow arrived. I told him we'd be meeting my financial advisor in a conference room at the resort, that she happened to be passing through the area for a client and had offered to do the paperwork in person. He was surprised but pleased. He dressed in the jacket he always wore when he wanted to seem like the most reliable man in the room. He walked through the conference room door, expecting a routine signing. Arthur was inside. So was the forensic accountant. So was a paralegal. A tablet, loaded with documentation, and a printed record of the conversation from the hallway. Reconstructed from memory and corroborated by something he didn't know existed. The housekeeper who had warned me? She wasn't just a housekeeper. My father had hired a private investigator 4 months before our wedding. He'd never told me, because he didn't want to influence me. He wanted me to have the chance to find out for myself or not. But the investigator had been quietly embedded in the resort staff during our stay. She'd heard enough in the days leading up to that night to know something was wrong. Warning me in the hallway was a judgment call she'd made on her own, and it was the call that changed everything, as what the investigator had collected over the previous 6 days, combined with the financial records Arthur had subpoenaed, built a picture that was impossible to argue away. Transfer attempts already initiated. Correspondence between my husband and Simone that predated our first date by 3 months. A spreadsheet. God help us, he actually kept a spreadsheet, cataloging assets across several relationships, with projected timelines for extraction. My name was on the most recent tab. The amount was circled. My husband sat down slowly when he understood what was in front of him. The jacket didn't help him now. There has to be a misunderstanding, he said. Arthur didn't blink. Attempted unauthorized transfer of jointly held inherited funds in conjunction with evidence of coordinated financial fraud across multiple parties. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a federal exposure. He looked at me then. For the first time since I'd walked into that room, he looked directly at me. Not with guilt. Not with love. With something I can only describe as recalibration. Like he was already deciding how to reframe things in this, how to recover, what angle might still work. Amara, he said, in the voice I'd once found warm, can we please just? No, I said. Simple as that. Arthur slid the annulment paperwork across the table. He stared at it. He looked at Arthur, then the accountant, then back at me. You're serious. I've never been less than serious, I said. He picked up the pen. It scratched across the signature line and I felt something in my chest release. Not relief, exactly. More like a door closing properly after being stuck open for too long. A click. A seal. As we stood to leave, he said quietly, "I gave you a year." I turned. "Excuse me?" "I gave you a year," he repeated. "Of real. I wasn't pretending the whole time." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about whether that was something I needed to carry with me. Whether it changed any of the math. It didn't. "I gave you everything my grandmother worked her whole life to build," I said. "Don't talk to me about what you gave." I walked out. He called twice that evening. I didn't answer. My father picked me up from the resort, and we drove through the desert as the sun went down, all of that red and gold spreading out over the canyon ridges, and neither of us said much. At some point, he reached over and put his hand over mine on the armrest, just for a second, and that was enough. What happened after? The investigations, the license suspensions, the legal proceedings in 2 different states. I didn't drive any of it personally. Arthur handled what needed handling. The investigators' documentation went where it needed to go. Other women were contacted by authorities, not by me. I didn't have the right to make that call for them. But I did give my statement willingly and completely, a resource being publicly acknowledged. Simone's financial consulting practice, which I later learned had served mainly as a vehicle for laundering funds from these arrangements, was shuttered within 30 days. The spreadsheet was apparently the piece of evidence that investigators found most useful. He'd labeled it meticulously. He was, in the end, very detail-oriented. About 3 weeks after I got home, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. 7 words. "Glad you didn't go back to your room." I smiled at my phone for a long time. I used to think that trusting someone was the same thing as being safe, that the 2 things lived together, naturally, that if you loved carefully and chose wisely and believed in the best of people, those things would protect you. My grandmother believed that too, I think, but she also believed in making sure what was hers stayed hers. She kept records. She read every document. She never signed anything she hadn't read twice. I understand her better now. Trust isn't blindness. Trust isn't... It's not the absence of evidence or the willingness to ignore what you see. Real trust, the kind worth building a life on, survives scrutiny. It doesn't need you to look away. My grandmother survived the Depression, raised 4 children, built her savings from almost nothing, left me enough to start a life. She spent 60 years making sure I'd have options. The only thing I'm sorry about is that I almost let someone take them from me. I didn't, though, and that's the part she would have wanted me to remember.